The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, your AML automation software for faster onboarding, smarter monitoring, and growth without overhead.
I read this article the other day. It referred back to Arnulf Øverland's poem from 1936, that you shall not sleep. And I think we have been sleeping. I really do. There's more looming on our doorstep than what we know.
Welcome to The Laundry, the podcast connecting AML compliance and financial crime to the real world. Think about the road you took to work this morning. Think about the flight you booked for your next holiday, or even the home that you're looking to buy. What if they were all made possible by shadowy deals between powerful corporations and oligarchs? In some cases, the very same Russian business elites accused of aiding the brutal invasion of Ukraine. But surely, this couldn't be happening in Scandinavia, where trust and transparency are core to our identity. Could it? I'm your host, Fredrik Riiser, Head of Strategy and Business Development at Strise, and in this episode, we are revealing how oligarchs embedded themselves across Scandinavia. We'll be discussing the institutions and businesses with hidden ownership secrets, how this happens, and what can be done about it. To dive into this topic, I'm here with my Laundry co-host, colleague, and dear friend, Robin Lycka, Solution Architect at Strise. Hello and a half to you, Robin, or Sanctions Man, as we like to call you. Welcome back to the show. What's your favorite part of your job?
Thank you, Fredrik. It's a pleasure to be here again with you as host. Well, it would be rude to say anything but to wake up in the morning knowing that I get to go to work and meet you.
Likewise. And thank you for the introduction. I think we'll just kick off and dive into the discussion. So let's start by looking at what the oligarchs own. Now, you've deep dived into this topic and presented it to many banks and institutions. But what was the starting point? What made you think that this was interesting to start looking into?
It's funny because it was actually, I kind of stumbled into the investigations part. I was speaking at a conference, and to prepare for this, I was looking into, this was post-invasion of Ukraine. I was looking into ownership and the Russian oligarchs in particular. And at that point in 2022, it was obviously a lot of interesting cases to come by because it was so quick after the invasion that you could still kind of uncover these more or less hidden ownerships now. In short, kind of stumbled into it. But the truth is, I was molded by it.
Awesome. So what is the pathway for oligarchs or the sanctioned individuals? How do they become owners and own big and important businesses and influence infrastructure and so forth?
Well, I guess there's kind of two parts to it. One is the obvious commercial interest. Some of these are large industry players. So if you look at like the metal industry, there is an actual commercial interest. But others seems to be more of an information perspective. So you're not necessarily buying into the company, you are buying into the information that you get access to by having ownership in the company.
Give us an example. What kind of information could you get?
I'd say that maybe one of the more obvious ones that are familiar to media in Norway might probably be Dominic Oil. So this was a relatively small exploration and production company based out of Norway, where the Norwegian government and the Russian government sat side by side in a company. Now, I find it difficult to see why there would be commercial interest with something like 30 million euros revenue in a relatively small EMP company in Norway. But the information they gain access to is more or less all of the natural resources on the Norwegian continental shelf.
But how does this happen then? Because there's plenty of buyers out there probably. Do you think these oligarchs are buying these based on premiums? Like, who sells to them, and why would they sell to them?
I think it probably starts off out of commercial interest. We've seen a few examples where these companies are they get an offer, or like there's a commercial interest, but then we've actually seen that more or less the government can actually stop this. We have an example of that as well. How it happens and why, I don't know. Like, they have incredible wealth. So it's kind of like looking at the oil fund. What do they invest in? They have so much capital to invest that it's almost difficult to find prospects. And if you look at it from an oligarch's perspective, they are so wealthy that they don't necessarily invest out of a commercial interest. They invest out of information and control.
You think it's government subsidized? Like, obviously, oligarchs is very closely tied to government in many cases, but you think it's oftentimes the government is actually pulling the strings and having these oligarchs buy into this type of companies to gain access to critical infrastructure and information?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. I think it's very plausible that there might be suggestions coming from a government mandate. It's difficult to not see that conversation happening. Like, hey, Oleg, if you buy that company, I'll shill you the metal license you need.
It makes sense. It's possible, that's for sure. You do give a number of real world examples, some which we can't name on the podcast. But let's talk about Strabag. What happened there? What's the story around Strabag?
This is probably one of those perspectives where it seems to be more of an information flow that's interesting, not necessarily a commercial interest. But Strabag being a listed company, they are publicly traded. So it's impossible for them to avoid being acquired, or like having a minority shareholder who ends up being a sanctioned individual. But they've been awarded several contracts. They operate in Scandinavia. They've built the Stockholm South tunnel called Slussen. They've built one of the roads that I usually drive through towards the western coast in Norway, towards Filefjell. So it's a bit strange to know that there was actually a Russian owner behind that Austrian company, and to think about why was this interesting? Why is it interesting for someone who's that incredibly wealthy to have ownership in a large infrastructure company like Strabag?
Why was it interesting, you think?
Well, to me, I'd say probably out of information purposes. I can't see anything but that. They have a commercial interest, and they've done everything right. Like, they've diluted the shares, freezed any voting rights, etc. So there's nothing that Strabag should have done differently.
Could you give us a flavor to some of the other businesses and infrastructure projects people might be surprised to hear that have oligarch ties?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are several companies that have open ownership which you can find publicly. So there's Nordic Water Products, or Sulzer Pumps, that manufacture pumps and equipment for water cleansing facilities. And the acquisition of Sulzer Pumps in itself was quite controversial back when that happened. I can't remember exactly which year, but by Victor Vekselberg. So at some point, they actually owned a majority stake of like 62 or 63%, I think. Now, this company in itself is probably not that interesting as well, but understanding what they control, when you think about it from like access to spare parts or pumps or whatever you might need long term for these water cleansing facilities, you are controlling an important stake of infrastructure in society.
And you mentioned that government did step in on a couple of occasions to shut these deals down.
Yeah.
Could you mention any examples and what the process would look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are several other both public and less public examples as well. There was a Swedish one where there were ties to an estate agent through a Russian oligarch. But where the government has intercepted, the most interesting example of that is probably Bergen Engines out of Norway. So this is an engine manufacturer, as the name implies, and they're one of the vendors that supply engines and equipment to the Norwegian military or armed forces. They had a commercial interest out of two Russian investors, and this got media's attention. So actually, if I remember everything correctly, what happened was that the media's attention is what caused the government to get involved. And ultimately, they actually stopped the sale of Bergen engines. And I believe something like a year after they stopped this sale, both of these Russian individuals was sanctioned by OFAC. It's the first case we have where the Norwegian government has gone in and stopped a commercial transaction or acquisition of a company out of the nation's security.
And this happened prior to them being sanctioned?
Yes.
Wow. Okay. So that means basically Bergen Engine or whoever oversaw the sale sold it to the highest bidder, probably. And then government stepped in, delayed the deal, potentially the transaction by at least a year. I wonder if they got compensated somehow.
They didn't get compensation, but they stopped the entire sales process. To my best knowledge, I believe the owners are still the same as they were. So they just didn't get to sell their company.
Interesting. You think the average Scandinavian would be surprised to know who's really behind the roads, tunnels, and so forth, and who sits on the ownership side and have access to this critical infrastructure?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think most people think about the commercial interest. We probably have a bit of that naivety in Scandinavia in general as to who we invite into our threshold and who's allowed to purchase what or acquire shares in what in this company, which is a bit strange. I read this article the other day, or it was a comment in Aftenposten. I can't remember the journalist or commentator, but it referred back to Arnulf Øverland's poem from 1936, that you shall not sleep. And I think we have been sleeping. I really do. There's more looming on our doorstep than what we know.
Great insights. And now, you know what it's time for? A quick break. So, dear listener, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with how the compliance industry fights back.
Live on stage at Venue 81 in Stockholm!
Want to energize your next event with something truly unexpected? Live on stage from Shoreditch Studios in London. The Laundry Live brings financial crime and compliance to life on stage, with laughs, insights, and a healthy dose of drama. Live on stage at the Ministry of Sound in London. From packed out venues to intimate in-house tapings, we've done it all. A live recording of The Laundry is the perfect way to engage your audience and bring fresh energy to your agenda.
Stockholm, please make some noise!
We love hitting the road, so if you're planning an event, why not add a little podcast magic? Email us at laundry@strise.ai to get started. We'll bring the microphones, you bring the crowd. We'll continue the discussion over pizza afterwards. I'm interested to learn more.
And welcome back, dear listeners. Having looked at the oligarchs in the system, let's move the chat on to what can be done about it. So you've picked some pretty startling examples, but how much do you think is still hidden when it comes to oligarchs and the ownership structures in Scandinavia?
I think looking at what's open, what you can already see is like, that's startling enough. What you can see is probably what should be more worrying. I'm more worried about the unknown unknowns than what we actually can see. And outside of Scandinavia, the patterns are just the same. There's the open part, the known part, like London's referred to as Londongrad and has been for a long time. It's the exact same pattern throughout all of these countries.
Because I was about to ask that. Obviously, we in Scandinavia we have quite close proximity to the borders of the likes of Russia, and the oligarchs. And you'd imagine, even though you can get a bank account pretty much everywhere if you have the means, it's still something with the close business ties and the network and cultural similarities and so forth. But you mentioned that the patterns are the same, so we shouldn't really feel more worried in Scandinavia than elsewhere that we're being taken advantage of, and these Russian oligarchs, as an example, is buying up critical infrastructure and gaining access to intel that might be used to weaken us in some sort of capacity in the future.
Not more than others, but I think everyone should feel worried about the kleptocracy and also the information warfare that's going on.
So what should compliance professionals be doing to find these potential links and fight back?
Well, yeah, some of the obvious red flags they should be looking for is recent change in activity. If you can see historical information in a company suggesting that there was at some point a Russian individual involved, why are they now no longer involved? What has changed? What kind of patterns have changed? Obviously, it's kind of venturing into ideas of sanctions evasion. That's more on the transactional side. What's changed in buyer patterns, seller patterns, etc. But yeah, there isn't one specific thing to look for. It's kind of just having the curiosity to explore and thinking like, why did this thing change? That's usually what I look for, at least.
In terms of having a holistic approach when it comes to defense, we talked about compliance professionals now, but what help and support would the compliance industry need from say law enforcement and government to help fight this?
I think one of the things that I've thought a lot about is that there are a lot of these known networks, both from intelligence perspective, but also from financial crime perspective. They have known networks of individuals that,
like crime syndicates.
Yes, that the governments have, but they're not sharing openly, so it can't be used for screening purposes. But it is, in fact, an extremely powerful screening tool. So that's one thing that I think should be shared. It's kind of like looking at it from a sanctions perspective. It would be one level below sanctions if you had a known network that you could use for screening purposes and get flags into screening systems. That's something that I think would be useful. Also, having more of an open source intelligence tool between compliance professionals so that you could kind of see a more of a feedback loop. So if there's someone that has reported something, that could be used in a loop back into other systems. And also getting feedback in general. If you file a suspicious activity report, usually the financial institutions or the regulated entity, they don't get any feedback until they see something in the news. So if you report something, you never know if it was a good report or if anything happened. Exactly. Unless it surfaced in the news.
Exactly. Yeah, that must be quite a frustrating part of the job if you're fighting the good battle and you keep on reporting these individuals or networks or businesses, and then you never know. Was that picked up? Was that a reason why somebody blocked the transaction, arrested someone, or similar? Do you think we're building good enough systems now, though, with the development that is happening to get to the point where, like you mentioned now, feedback loops are closer and intelligence are more utilized across both businesses and governmental functions?
There are signs of a good direction, at least. But I also think that a lot of these systems are kind of just putting us again into the game of cat and mouse, where the criminals or the individuals that you're trying to avoid are always one step ahead. So it's an extremely reactive industry where something happens and then the regulations follow and then technology follows regulations. So an example of that in AML D6, you see that if there's a high risk entity or an EDD process, you lower the threshold of calculating your UBOs. And you could see that as a reactive measure of the sanctioned individuals and what they have orchestrated every single time when they have been sanctioned, we see this orchestration of changing ownership, shifting shares, lowering threshold to just below 25% or just below the 50% rule. So there's a lot of that orchestration going on. And then you get the reactive measure of changing the regulation, which means technology needs to follow and change thresholds. And then, affecting things like the UBO register. The UBO register doesn't necessarily follow suit with that need to lower the threshold of identifying the UBOs.
That's where it's very interesting with the development in terms of network intelligence and graph models and so forth as well, where you wouldn't necessarily have to look at having a threshold of 15%, 10%, 25%. You could set it up to be more binary. Obviously, you're at the risk of having a lot of false positives if you include quote unquote everyone. But the better these models get, the more we can utilize AI and the algorithms, the more precise they get. At some point, it might be binary where you could look into someone's network and say, these are known criminals or known sanctioned individuals that is just one or two layers away from the one that you're about to do business with. And I think that's very interesting. It's a positive step in the right direction, at least.
Absolutely.
And speaking of, how do we stop this happening in the future? Because it's been in the way of the world for quite a long time, where the people with the most means have been able to buy up quite a lot of big businesses and infrastructure and so forth. And obviously it's a big pants type of game where you got to have a lot of money to play, and it's not easy to find a lot of buyers when it comes to something that you would expect to get $1 billion or £1 billion or whatever from your sale from, right?
Yeah, I think the important element is for the commercial interest to understand, why does someone have an interest in their company? I think we need to wake up from that naivety that we've had with these oligarchs and kleptocrats coming in, but that's it's a commercial aspect to it. It's not the society's responsibility. It's not something that the regulators can stop. They can't go in and stop a property transaction from a kleptocrat. But the commercial seller should feel that interest. It should be something that we take responsibility for from a commercial aspect and wake up from our sleep.
And why is this important? What happens if we continue to get this wrong and don't start fixing this?
Well, in the example of Bergen Engines, how would it look like if one of the largest suppliers for the Norwegian Armed Forces was actually owned by two sanctioned individuals? It sounds so dumb. It's so obvious when you hear it. And we could end up in so many more of these situations if we just start looking at who owns what across commercial interests, across infrastructure. I think it's blatantly obvious after the fact, but we should have more intelligence, more curiosity into which companies have commercial interest in especially infrastructure and positions of information warfare.
Makes sense. And before we end this episode, we're going to dish out a few quick-fire questions for you. Are you ready, Robin?
Yes.
How big of an issue is oligarch ownership in Scandinavia infrastructure and business?
It's probably not a big issue from a scale perspective, but it might be a big issue from an information and war by other means perspective.
What is the most surprising piece of infrastructure you found to be connected to sanctioned Russian ownership?
The most surprising one is probably the examples that I can't talk about, but real estate acquired by Russian oligarchs, probably Nordic Water Products is interesting. Infrastructure companies like Strabag, The German travel giant was a big one, not to mention names.
What should compliance professionals be looking out for?
They should be looking out for any kind of smoke signals, recent changes, something that, like, if there's anything at all that looks suspicious, travel down that rabbit hole.
Have sanctions done enough to disrupt oligarch ownership in Scandinavia?
Sanctions alone, yes. Actually, there are quite good examples where sanctions have done their job in Scandinavia, but sanctions is something that happens after the fact. Once that ownership has gone through, once they've acquired the information they wanted, doesn't matter if there are sanctions after the fact.
That brings this spin of the laundry to an end. Robin, thank you so much for sharing the information. Where can people find and connect with you?
Oh, my LinkedIn /Robin Lycka or robin@strise.ai.
And thank you for listening. If you have enjoyed the podcast, check out the back catalog of 7 seasons and more than 120 episodes, and follow The Laundry on your podcast platform of choice. We'd love for you to share the podcast on your social media channels. Tell a colleague about it. Give us a 5-star rating. It really does help people find us. What subjects do we need to cover? Comment on the Strise LinkedIn, my LinkedIn, or email laundry@strise.ai. Your host for this episode was me, Fredrik. Our producer was Matthew. Our editor was Dominic, and our engineer was Nicholas. The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise. Visit strise.ai for more information. See you next time.
Money makes a world go round. It makes a world go round.
Look at me, Fredrik. Look at me.
I am the host
I am
now.
the host now.
I am the host now. Look at me. I am the host now.
The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, your AML automation software for faster onboarding, smarter monitoring, and growth without overhead.